If somebody, God forbid, has harmed us and they come to ask forgiveness, we all know that the Torah encourages us to forgive them. But do we know that there are 3 possible levels at which that forgiveness can happen? Our parasha describes the story of the snakes that attacked the Jewish people, and then Moshe was told to make a copper snake in order to help them. So the pasuk tells us, Moshe Gomer, what happened is the people spoke out against Moshe and against Hashem. And the Eibush sent these snakes. So the people came in front of Moshe and said, "Oh, we're out of line. We sinned. Hispalel Hashem, please daven to Hashem, and remove these snakes from us." So Moshe did so. And Moshe davened on the people's behalf. So Rashi comments on those words that Moshe davened for the people and tells us, Mikan, from this story we learn, that if somebody is requested to forgive, that he shouldn't be cruel and refuse to forgive. V'yesh gorsin, or another version of what Rashi says is, achzori limchol. He shouldn't be cruel to forgive. Strange expression, we'll discuss it later in the Sikha. Where does Rashi get it from? This statement of Rashi seems to be based on the Medrash Tanchuma, which says that this pasuk illustrates Moshe's extreme humility. That he didn't delay asking compassion for them, the Eibishter's forgiveness for them. As well as to show us the power of tshuva. As soon as they acknowledge that they had sinned, immediately he and the Eibishter listened to them and was amenable to them. And from here we learn that a person who is supposed to forgive should not be cruel. And we have precedent, because likewise we see that Avraham Avinu davened on behalf of Avimelech, and the Eibishter healed Avimelech and his family from the disease that they had, which was basically stopping up their biological systems because they had taken sorrow. There the Medrash also quotes another passage from Eov. We're not going to get into it because we're going to focus on the story of Avraham Avinu compared to our story over here. We need to understand. If Rashi is based on the Medrash Tanchuma, why does Rashi say, here is the source for the idea that if somebody asks you forgiveness, don't be cruel and forgive them? The Medrash, which Rashi is basing himself on, illustrates that we could have learned this principle from a much earlier part of the Torah, by Yisrael Avram Gomer, where Avram Avinu davened on behalf of Avimelech, as the Tanchuma points out. So why is Rashi saying, Mikan, this is the source of this principle? Why don't we learn it earlier from Avram Avinu's conduct? Void. Furthermore, to learn from Avram Avinu not to be difficult when it comes time to forgive is something quoted in a clear Mishnah in Bava Kama, which says, even though a person who's injured somebody else has to pay 5 penalties, still the person is not yet forgiven for the pain that he caused him and the shame that he caused him, until he asks for forgiveness. As the pasuk says by Avram Avinu, that the Eibishter tells Avimelech to return Sarah Imenu to Avram Avinu. And the Mishnah then says, and how do we know that if a person refuses to forgive, that person is considered cruel? Or another version of the Mishnah says, that you should not be cruel when it's time to forgive. Based on the pasuk of Avram Avinu. That Avram Avinu, without hesitation, davened to the Eibishter in order to help Avimelech out of his difficulty, and the Eibishter listened and healed him. Which makes it so strange. How come Rashi, who has taken the simplest understanding of the Pesukim, tells us we learn this principle of not withholding forgiveness from here, from Moshe, with the snakes, why didn't Rashi tell us we learn it from the story of Avraham Avinu davening on behalf of Avimelech, as the Mishnah clearly tells us? Especially when you consider if you look at the story of Avraham Avinu, it's actually a bigger story of forgiveness. Why? Because the injustice that was done by Avimelech to Avraham Avinu is much greater. Surely, kidnapping, abducting Sarah is much more painful and much more of an affront to Avraham Avinu than the people speaking out against Moshe Rabbeinu. As well as you can see in that scenario, removing the problem was in a sense swifter. There, the Torah tells us Avraham Avinu davened, immediately Hashem healed Avimelech. Whereas in our parasha, there's a whole process that first has to happen before the people are saved. You have to make this cup of snake, and anybody who's bitten has to go to the snake and they have to look at the snake, and only then are they going to be forgiven. Which means that the punishment was not immediately removed. So surely the better example of the urgency to forgive is the story of Avraham Avinu, not Mikan from Moshe Rabbeinu. So we're going to suggest two possible answers. The first of which is perhaps we could suggest if you're taking Rashi's lens, which is to look at the simple understanding of the pasuk, maybe only our story has a story of forgiveness, whereas Avraham Avinu is not necessarily forgiveness. Why? The Yidden came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they made a confession. Chotonu, they said we sinned because we spoke against you and against Hashem. Therefore, Hashem, we're now contrite. Please daven to Hashem to remove this threat of the snakes. But Avimelech, there's no record that he asked forgiveness of Avraham Avinu. In fact, to the contrary, when he said, what did we do to you? How did I sin against you? Because you brought upon us a terrible sin, allowing me to think that your wife is your sister. You did things to me that people don't do. What motivated you to do this? That is not a request for forgiveness. Actually, it sounds like an accusation against Avraham Avinu. So maybe that's why Rashi says, Mikan, here's the situation that teaches us about a person asking Mechila to grant it to them, because Avimelech was not asking Mechila. This idea that Avimelech did not frame it as a request for forgiveness is stated in the Tosefta. That if a person injures somebody else, even if the person who is the perpetrator did not ask for forgiveness, you as a decent human being should still daven on their behalf. How do we know it? From the story of Avram, implying that the Tosefta thinks Avimelech did not ask for Mechila. So that would explain why Rashi is not going to use that, surely, as the precedent for the idea that if it's time to forgive, don't be difficult about forgiving. Which would explain why Rashi thinks our situation, where the people asked Mechila of Moshe Rabbeinu and he quickly responded to them, that would be the template of how we're supposed to treat other people. Sounds like a good answer, but it's not actually a good answer. Why? Because the truth of the matter is that if you really think about what we've just said, actually it makes the question stronger. Why don't we use Avram as the standard? Avram Avinu davened that even in a scenario where the person has not asked for forgiveness, learn from Avram Avinu. Don't be difficult and go ahead and forgive them. We can work out logically that if that's how you treat a person who has not asked for forgiveness, how much more so should you treat a person who has asked for forgiveness, and don't be cruel about it. And also, don't think for a moment that just because the Torah did not use the word Mechila, it just says that Avraham Avinu davened for Avimelech, and maybe that means he didn't actually forgive him, he just davened for him. That possibly Avraham Avinu was davening for Avimelech without Avimelech requesting forgiveness, and without Avraham Avinu granting forgiveness. Because we see, for example, Avraham Avinu davened for the people of Sodom. He wasn't forgiving them. It wasn't even in his position to forgive them. And maybe you could fit that into the words of the Tosefta as well. Can't say that. First of all, it's a stretch to think that Avraham Avinu, a person of his caliber, was going to daven for Avimelech and still hold a grudge and not have forgiven him. And the truth of the matter is that even if you want to say that Avraham Avinu davened and didn't per se forgive, that still doesn't prove that this is the one place that teaches us don't be difficult to forgive. Because over there it says that Avraham Avinu davened, not that he forgave, and over here it says Moshe davened, not that he forgave. So how does it help to say, well, Rashi didn't want to learn it from there because Avraham Avinu is only davening? Well, here Moshe is only davening. So therefore we have to conclude that if the tzaddik is davening for them to be relieved of their punishment, that means that there's forgiveness. Which means that the fact that Avraham Avinu davened for Avimelech surely is as good a proof of the fact that you're supposed to not hold a grudge and be willing to forgive, like the pasuk of Moshe. In which case, we're back to our original question: why is Rashi insisting mikan that this is where we learn that you shouldn't be difficult when it's time to forgive, and not from Avraham Avinu? Let's try another answer. That Rashi does not believe you could learn this principle from Avraham Avinu davening for Avimelech. Why? Because it's a different story. You have to ask Mechila if you did something that was wrong. In Avimelech's mind, he didn't do anything wrong. Avimelech's claim was, I did this with innocence. And Eibishter endorsed that and said, you're right, you were innocent, technically. The Eibishter says, I know that you didn't have ill intentions. And I prevented you from sinning against me. And therefore I prevented you from getting anywhere near to Sarah Imenu. In other words, the story over there, Avimelech did not have a malicious intention against Avraham Avinu. And if you didn't have malicious intention against Avraham Avinu, then there's no reason to ask forgiveness, and there's no reason to give forgiveness. So maybe that's the reason Rashi says that's not where we learn about forgiveness from. And likewise, you can read that into the Eibishter's response to Avimelech, where he tells him, now, return the wife to this man because he is a prophet. He'll daven for you and you'll live. In other words, what's the Eibishter saying? All you need to do is give Sarah back. If you just give Sarah back, that will be enough for him to daven on your behalf. That will then cure you. As Rashi points out, you can give Sarah back with a clear conscience. He's not going to have a grudge against you. He's not going to hate you. Because he's a Navi. He'll know that you hadn't touched his wife. That's why he will daven on your behalf. So that seems to imply that we can understand why Rashi wants to say Mikan, our story of Moshe and the snakes is where you learn about Mechila, because in the case of Avimelech, there isn't really the basis for Mechila, because there isn't really a crime. Whereas from the pasuk where it says that Avimelech gave Avram Avinu cattle and sheep and servants, which Rashi explains, why did he do that? In order that Avram Avinu should be placated, and that would then lead him to daven on Avimelech's behalf. That implies not as we thought, but rather that implies that Avimelech had to position himself in some way of looking for Mechila, and Avram Avinu had to be in some way placated. As is proven by the fact that Avraham Avinu doesn't say, I don't need your gifts. It's as if to say, yes, it's appropriate for you to give me the gifts because you did something wrong. If he had no malicious intent, why does he have to placate Avraham Avinu, and why would he have to ask for forgiveness? Because the reality is Avimelech did something wrong, something seriously wrong. With regards to Avram, he took his wife. And the fact that Avimelech so-called had innocent intentions doesn't undermine the fact that he harmed them as a family. So obviously, for the fact that he says, listen, I didn't realize, but I still have to apologize, and Avraham Avinu has to still tell him, it's okay. In which case, our original question stands. Why does Rashi not learn from the story of Avram? From here, we learn that you should not be cruel when it's time to forgive. You should be willing to forgive. To get to understand what Rashi is telling us, let's go back to the unusual wording that Rashi used. Rashi said that the lesson over here is that you should not be cruel from, in other words, not to forgive. Now that's different to the medrash that he is supposed to be based on. In the medrash it said that the forgiver should not become cruel. Or the other expression we have is same principle. In various places we have this, that the person giving forgiveness should not be cruel. Similar expression we have in the Mishnah, which says that you shouldn't be achzori melimchol. Rashi doesn't use that expression. Instead, he writes, not that you, the person, the forgiver, should not be cruel, but that you shouldn't be cruel around your forgiveness. Okay? So most of the sources say, don't be cruel not to forgive. And Rashi is saying, don't be cruel in the way you forgive, essentially. In other words, Rashi is not talking about whether or not you will forgive. That's implied in the Midrash. That's implied in the Mishnah. That you shouldn't be somebody who is cruel, who refuses to forgive. That's not what Rashi is saying. Rashi is saying you're already ready to forgive. Don't be achzori milimchol. The way that you forgive should not be in a cruel way. How could you forgive in a cruel way? And the answer is because forgiveness can manifest in many ways. We're going to look at three. Aleph, the first, the most basic is a person forgives somebody who harmed them so that the perpetrator will not be punished. Okay, I'm dropping charges. Beis, the second is I'm not only forgiving the person because I don't want them to suffer. The truth is, I'm letting it go. I'm not going to hold any resentment in my heart. And then the highest level is Gimel, absolute forgiveness, which means I'm not, okay, let it go. No, it's not just let it go. This is, I'm going to full-heartedly forgive the person, and now this person is as good as they were before they did anything against me. It's as if nothing happened. We've completely restored the relationship. Of Signan Achek. In other words, the first version, which is, okay, you did something wrong, I'm dropping the charges against what you did wrong. The issue no longer exists, so you're not going to be punished or held accountable for it. The second version is saying, no, I'm actually dealing with you as a person, not just with what you did, that it's okay and it doesn't count for anything, but you as a person, I no longer have an issue with you. And the third level of forgiveness is you completely uproot any damage or any negativity that existed, and it's like you're starting afresh. So here are practical differences between these three approaches. Let's say that a person is just trying to avoid somebody being punished on their account. So then what are they going to do? Then the degree of effort that I'm going to invest in this is going to be enough to ensure no punishment. That's it. So as soon as I get you off the hook, I go to the police station, I drop the case, there are no criminal charges, I'm done. I don't need to see you again, I don't need to have anything to do with you again. I removed the problem. That was my intention. Whereas the second approach, and especially the third approach, which is this full-hearted forgiveness, this is not just simply removing the issue. I am concerned for that person's well-being. Hagan, they hurt me. Which means the person is going to invest a lot more effort and energy into this forgiveness process, that it's not going to be just about me not feeling angry or resentful. It's about that person becoming a better person, even as they were prior to any misdeeds, before they did anything wrong against me. Now, once we understand these different forms of Mechila, then we can understand the difference between Vayispal Avram, Mechila Shel Avram, the kind of forgiveness that Avram Avinu gave Avimelech in that context, and compared to what Moshe Rabbeinu is doing for the Yidden over here. But Avram is technical forgiveness. That what happened, Avram Avinu davened that Avimelech and family should be healed and they could all resume their bodily functions. In other words, the focus of Avram Avinu's davening is remove the pain from Avimelech. That the punishment decreed against him should go. But in our parasha, it doesn't say, here's the key words. It doesn't just say we have Moshe davened. Like that, it says that Avram Avinu davened. And at the Sefes HaGosha, the Torah adds words that don't have to be there. We know the context. The people have come to Moshe, and obviously Moshe is davening for them. So why then does the Torah add Vayispal Moshe be'ad ha'am, that Moshe is davening for the people? Obviously he's davening for the people. Who else is he davening for? The Torah wants us to know that the state of the people bothers Moshe. Ba'ad ha'am, he's on their side, he's looking for their interest. Therefore, he's not only davening that the people should no longer be attacked by the snakes, he's davening that the people should become better people. And that's why the Eibishter responds, not just with, okay, we're all good, make a copper snake, and don't just make a copper snake, but I say, out of your funds, Moshe Rabbeinu. Like in Parshas Ba'aloischa, where Moshe Rabbeinu said, when it came time to make the silver trumpets, the Eibishter said, I say, you, Moshe, have to pay for the project. Now, if you think about it logically, why should Moshe pay for the snake? It's to help the people. Surely they should pay for it. Moshe, the purpose of the snake is to save those people who spoke badly about Hashem and Moshe. Surely the snake should have been bought out of communal funds so they could be part of the process. But the Eibishter said, you know why we're going to do it this way? Because it needs to be clear that this is lecha, that this is out of your pocket. This is something that bothers you as an individual. This is not just about removing problems from the Jewish people. You care about their well-being. And then you'll be showing the people you're standing ba'adam, you're standing on their side, you're supporting them, you're caring about them. And that was the purpose of this copper snake. Not only to say, to heal the Jewish people, even though that was part of its purpose, but rather to inspire the people. As we well know, that the reason they had to look up at this copper snake was in order to refocus themselves looking towards the Eibishter, so that they would feel a sense of tshuva. That they shouldn't only repent for the specific issue that occurred, that they spoke out of turn, but they should shift themselves completely to subject themselves to the Eibishter. That's why the Eibishter told them, put it on a pole, and then if somebody gets bitten, then he should go and look up at the copper snake and he'll live. As Rashi explains. And that's why, unlike in the case of Avram Avinu, he davens and Avimelech is healed, here Moshe davens and there's no silver bullet. It's not like the case of Avram Avinu. As soon as he davens, Avimelech is healed. Moshe Rabbeinu has to make a snake and he has to put it on a pole, and people have to go over it and they have to look at it. Because the goal of it is not to protect them from the poisonous snakes. It's to get and inspire the people to do tshuva in a meaningful way, to subjugate themselves to the Eibishter. And that's why Rashi says, Mikan. This is the example that teaches us that if a person requests forgiveness, you should not be achzori milimchol. Not that you shouldn't be cruel and not forgive them, but you shouldn't be cruel milimchol in the way you forgive them. Meaning, The way it's described in other places, which is that you, the forgiver, should not be cruel, we're talking about you and your attitude. That the person shouldn't take a harsh position. Meaning, if a person refuses to forgive somebody, and therefore that person is going to suffer, that's cruel. And that concept that you shouldn't be cruel and you should be willing to forgive, we learn that taka from Avram Avinu. But here, what we're learning in our parasha, which is new information, is that even when you've taken the decision that you will forgive this person, don't do it in a way that could be some watered-down version of achzorius. In other words, so we're not describing you as a person, whether you're a harsh person or an amenable person. Telling, don't be cruel, because then you won't forgive. And if you don't forgive, that person's going to be punished. Now we're not talking about the achzorius of the person, we're talking about the achzorius of the type of mechila that a person decides to take. That you shouldn't forgive in such a way that it is forgiveness, and yet with a twang of difficulty, of harshness, of cruelty. What does that mean? Let's say that a person forgives only to the extent that they want to ensure that the person is no longer punished. That's not true forgiveness. That is harsh forgiveness. Because you still got stuff that you're dealing with. You still have a negative view of this person. That means you still got some harshness towards them. So only when a person wholeheartedly forgives a person to the extent that you don't have any grudge against them and you wish for them the best, then you could say there is no hint of achzorius in that forgiveness. Now, if you remember right at the beginning of the Sikha, we said that there's another variation of what Rashi said. Not achzori mi limchol, but achzori limchol. Weird expression, right? Harsh to forgive. So, just a sidebar. If there had originally been a version of Rashi that said Achzori limchol, you can understand how somebody editing Rashi down the line said that doesn't seem to make sense and decided to change it to mi limchol. Because the person reading this says, I don't understand how the two words go together. Cruel to forgive. How can you be cruel to forgive? And therefore, they would have inserted the letter mem to say, don't be cruel to prevent you from forgiving. But of course, if the original had said milimchol, who would have ever thought, oh, that doesn't sound right, let's change it to limchol. So the fact that we have two versions of Rashi implies that actually the original version was probably limchol. Now what does that mean? How could you be cruel to forgive? Surely it's cruel not to forgive. So just to give a little bit of an insight into how this works, I know since we're told that if a person gives tzedakah to a poor person, but with a sour face, the person's done a mitzvah called tzedakah, but they lose their value of the tzedakah, even if it was a huge amount, because of the attitude. So in the same way, a person's forgiven the person, but they could lose the value of the forgiveness because of their attitude. So now we understand that there are three possible layers of forgiveness. The lowest is just simply removing any I don't want it on my head that this person's being punished. That is actually a cruel version of forgiveness. A better version of forgiveness is I want to clear my heart, that there's no negativity. And the highest version of forgiveness is work with that person, rehabilitate that person so well that they're as good as they were before. With that in mind, we're going to see that the Rambam on three different occasions talks about this principle of withholding forgiveness in three different ways, which will align with what we've just learned. And again in Anal, we can now observe and understand differences that the Rambam uses in his language on the subject. This concept that a person who's due to forgive should not be cruel about it is something the Rambam discusses at least three times. Hilchos Deos, Hilchos Tshuva, Hilchos Chovel Mazik. Hilchos Deos, Kosav, and Hilchos Deos, which is all about the character development of a human being. He says, if somebody harms somebody else, sins against somebody else, don't hold a grudge and stay silent and don't share with him that he hurt you. And you have to tell the person, tell the person straight, you did this, you hurt me. And then he concludes there. If that person then says oy vey and comes to ask for forgiveness, you have to forgive him. Here's the key words. And the person forgiving should not be cruel about it. And then, of course, the story of Avraham Avinu. So what does he say there? The person, when somebody comes to ask you for forgiveness, you should not be cruel about it. Bechus Tshuva, there he says, it's forbidden for a person to be cruel. And refuse to be placated. But you should be easy, amenable to being placated, and difficult or unable to get angry easily. And when a person asks you for forgiveness, you should forgive them with a full heart and a willing spirit. And then when he talks about an actual practical example where somebody's injured somebody else, there he says, if the person who has been injured has been approached for mechila, he should not be cruel and refuse to forgive. That's not the way of the Jewish people. If the person approaches you and literally beseeches you once, twice, and you know that this person's really done tshuva, and regrets what they did wrong, forgive them. Not only forgive them, if a person is quick to forgive, that is amazing, and that's praiseworthy, and the Chachamim love such a person. Now we're going to identify 4 areas of difference between the language that the Rambam uses in these 3 places, and that's all going to speak to what we've just been talking about, the different levels of mechila. So we need to understand why the Rambam addresses the same issue in different ways in 3 different places. There are 4 major differences. Number 1, Aleph. In Hilchos Deis he says, don't be, right, if the person approaches you for forgiveness, don't be cruel. Whereas, whereas in the 2 other sources, he doesn't say don't be cruel. He says you're not allowed to be cruel. So how come in Hilchos Deis does he say you shouldn't hesitate to forgive? And in the other place it says you're not allowed to hesitate, not allowed to be cruel about it. Second difference, base. In Chovel Mazik, the Rambam gives the whole story of the details under what circumstances does the obligation to forgive begin. What is that? The person approached you and begged for forgiveness twice. And you know that he did tshuva. And you know that he changed his mind and he feels bad about what he's done. Then you forgive him. You don't have that level of detail in the other 2 places. In both Hilchos Tshuva and Hilchos Deis, we don't find all of the details of what the person has to approach before you forgive him. That you have to wait for him to ask twice, etc. The only thing that it does say over there in Hilchos Tshuva is that if the person refuses to forgive, bring 3 sets of good friends, and 3 friends and then another 3 friends, whatever, until eventually you get him, hopefully, to forgive. But what is interesting is, over there, in Hilchos Tshuva, tells us something else. Details about the attitude of the forgiver. So in Hilchos Chovel Mazik, it tells us details of the approach of the perpetrator. And in Hilchos Tshuva, it tells us details of the attitude of the victim. You should be willing to be placated, and you should find it difficult to get angry. And if the person asks you for forgiveness, give it to them wholeheartedly. Even if he did terrible things against you and many things against you, don't take revenge, don't hold a grudge, because that's the Jewish way. So how come in Chovel Mazik do we talk about all the responsibility that the perpetrator has, and in Hilchos Tshuva, all the responsibility that the victim, the forgiver, has? Number 3, look at the language difference. In Hilchos Deis it says the forgiver should not be cruel. Hilchos Tshuva says it says a person which is a much more generic expression, should not be cruel. Whereas in Chevel Mazik he says the injured, in other words, the victim, should not be cruel. Why those distinctions? And lastly, also, there's additional language in Hilchos Tshuva. Hilchos Tshuva says, a person should not be cruel and not allow themselves to be placated. Likewise, in the laws of personal injury, what does it say? That you shouldn't be cruel and not forgive. Whereas Hilchos Deis just says, don't be achzori melimchol. So why those differences? So plugging in the information that we have, that there are 3 different levels of forgiveness, just ensuring that the person is not punished, removing any grudge from our hearts, or rehabilitating the person back to their original status. So we're going to see 3 similar distinctions over here in the Rambam. What's the Rambam talking about in personal injury? He's talking about the laws of personal injury, and forgiveness is a subsection of the laws of personal injury. In other words, means if in a case where a person's actually been harmed, these are the laws. When a person is forgiving somebody who hurt them, you could release some of the punishment they deserve. For example, you could say, you don't have to pay me the tsar, you don't have to pay me the boishas, whatever the case is. Beis Tshuva, what's the approach of the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva? There he's talking about the process of forgiveness as part of the rehabilitation of the perpetrator. It's the laws of Tshuva. How do you fix this? You did something wrong. How do you fix it? You have to ask Mechila. Which means that the forgiveness becomes part of allowing the Tshuva to be a wholesome Tshuva. Because now what's going to happen is, if the person is forgiven, they are restored, they are rehabilitated back to who they were originally. And Hilchos Deis is somewhere in the middle. Hilchos Deis is all about who you should be as a person. It's talking about human character. And one of the character traits that a person should have is forgiveness. It's part of the human development. In other words, there, the Rambam is talking about you as a person, what it means to be a forgiver. Again, Chovel Mazik is talking about how do you deal with the consequence of somebody's harm, and what can you let go because you're forgiven. Hilchos Tshuva, how do you help the person rehabilitate properly? He's trying to do Tshuva. Your Mechila is going to help him do Tshuva. Hilchos Deis, what's it all about? What kind of a person are you? That's why I go to Hilchos Deis. How does the Rambam begin? He says, if a person harms somebody else, don't hold a grudge silent in your heart, and a mitzvah tell him what's going on. If we're talking about let the guy know, don't hold a grudge, we're not talking about the perpetrator. We're talking about the victim. That he should not house within his heart hatred towards the person who hurt him. To the contrary, he's got to go and confront him and say, this is what happened. It's part of being a mensch, it's part of midos, it's how a human being is supposed to, how a Jewish person is supposed to behave. In that context, now that we're talking about you as a person, how to behave, then he says, if the guy does now ask forgiveness, you have to forgive him, and you may not be cruel about it. This is not the place to say you're not allowed to be cruel. Or say if he's approached you multiple times, you have to forgive him. That's not what we're talking about over here. We're not talking about the halacha, the technicality of forgiveness. We're talking about what kind of a human being should you be. Because here we're talking about the benefit to you as the forgiver. You become a mensch, you become a decent human being aligned with the principles of Torah. Because in the context of who you are as a person, if somebody's knocking on your door asking for forgiveness, your approach as a refined, developed human is forgive him immediately. Don't hold back. Be a mensch. We're talking to you. What kind of a human you have to be. Whereas in the halachas of personal injury, then why are we talking about forgiveness? Because we're talking about how this person clears the air from the sin that they've done. As the Rambam said in the immediately preceding halacha, that if a person has injured somebody else, they can pay all the penalties in the world, but they are not forgiven until they've made an approach to actually ask for forgiveness. In that context, so this is part of how they clear all the consequences against them. We say, there we have to give this detail. How does the person get to the point that they have cleared all of the consequences? The person has to make an approach and another approach. And the victim has to understand that they mean this sincerely because they've already done tshuva. And the person has regretted their bad behavior. Then yimcholoi. This is not so much about the forgiver, this is about the perpetrator sorting himself out. Only when the person observes, wow, look how humble this person is in his approach. He's asking me again and again for forgiveness, which is evidence that he obviously feels a regret and he's doing tshuva. Then it makes sense that you should forgive him for what he did wrong. Whereas Chuvah, now we're talking about the person rehabilitating themselves, coming back to a state of shleimus, and how forgiveness fits into that process. That's why the introduction that the Rambam gives to this topic there in the preceding halacha is that Tshuva and Yom Kippur can only sort out Averos between a person and the Eibishter. But if a person harmed another person, including physical injury, or goisler, or stole from them, etc., that person cannot be forgiven until you pay back what you took. And you've placated the person. And even if you returned all the money, paid all the reparations, you still have to ask mechila, because that's what completes tshuva. So now we talk about tshuva as a process for the perpetrator, and mechila is part of that process. Therefore, in that context, the Rambam tells us that if you are being approached by somebody who's really trying to do tshuva, you're not permitted to make it hard for them. Even though you could say this is really something that's a topic for human development, part of Hilchos Deos. Because the concept of forgiveness and the best form of forgiveness, which is wholehearted, is relevant to that person, the perpetrator, being able to do tshuva. In other words, in order for his forgiveness to be more than just removing the consequences, the topic we talk about in Chovel Mazik, but a full type of mechila, that the person restores themselves to a state of innocence like they were before anything went wrong. For that, which is Hilchos Tshuva, about bringing the person to proper tshuva, the victim has to forgive with the whole heart. That's why in Hilchos Tshuva we don't have to go through the details of how many times the person has to approach. That's technical. That belongs in Chovel Mazik, where we're talking about how does the person get out of punishment. But in Hilchos Tshuva we say, as soon as the person makes a sincere approach, forgive them sincerely. Illustrating that over here the purpose is not just to remove the problem, but to really wholeheartedly forgive the person to the point that they're reinstated as the decent person they always were. So that's exactly what we're seeing over here, the different kinds of mechila. The kind of mechila to get rid of punishment, gesund to hate, that's what Avraham Avinu did for Avimelech. That's what the Rambam is talking about in Chovel Mazik, which is all about consequences. A deeper form of mechila than that is the mechila where you actually clear your heart and you don't have any negativity against them. That's Hilchos Deos. Be a mensch, be somebody who doesn't hang on to your issues. The ultimate form of tshuva, which is what Moshe Rabbeinu is doing for the Yidden in the Midbar, and giving them a process with the Nechash and Nechoshes that will allow them to reinstate not only this issue in their lives, but their whole relationship with Hashem. That's like Hilchos Tshuva, where the person is doing tshuva, so facilitate their tshuva in the best way possible to be the most wholesome kind of tshuva. How so? By forgiving them b'leiv shalom. With that, we can look at the technical differences between each of these references. That explains the different language that the Rambam uses in these three occasions. In the laws of Chovel Mazik, which is all about making sure the person's not going to be punished, it says, he says, you're not allowed to be cruel and not forgive. In the case of Vichas Tshuva, it says, you're not permitted to be achzori, and not be placated. What's the difference between forgive and placated? So we understand in Chovel Mazik, the whole purpose of the Mechila is with regard to the harm that was done and to remove the consequences / punishment for that harm. So therefore we say you're forbidden to perpetuate the problem. In other words, you can't be a cruel person who's going to sit by as this person gets punished, and therefore you have to forgive them. You got to clean the slate. Whereas Sichas Tshuva, which is describing the highest form of Mechila, the objective of the forgiveness is not just to remove the problem that was created by this person's affront. Could go in with a person injured or cursed or stole, or even just somebody irritated you, aggravated you, as the Rambam says in the previous halacha. Here we're talking about an Adam. We're talking about a Jewish person living as a Jewish person should, which is that you care about the well-being of the next person. And therefore it's not good enough just to say, what do you want from me? I'll let him off the hook. I drop the charges against him. He's not going to be punished. I'm good. That's why the emphasis is not just limchol, like in Chovel Mazik, but lispayes. You have to feel differently. You have to be placated. Because if you're placated to the point that you forgive with a full heart, then that person achieves full tshuva, which is the purpose. And that will help us understand an apparent contradiction within the Rambam's own language, as the Lechem Mishnah points out. What does he say? So he says there that if a person had caused financial loss to another person, pay back the money and you're forgiven. And they doesn't speak at all about asking forgiveness. Whereas in Hilchos Tshuva, he includes in the kind of crimes for which a person has to forgive a financial crime, stealing. He includes it as one of the things that a person is not forgiven until he's paid the money. Until he's been moichel him. Why? Because the truth is, if you're just talking about relieving a financial loss, in other words, repaying a financial loss, you don't actually need mechila for that. In other words, to remove the punishment. But if you want to get to the ultimate state of being wholehearted and forgiving and allowing the person to reinstate themselves, the topic discussing the Tshuva, then the person has to look for mechila, even when it's just a financial crime that can be easily replaced. Just pay back the money. As we well know that the Eibishter tells us mitzvahs because he does those mitzvahs too. So as we've just illustrated in the words of the Rambam, that the way of the Jewish people is to forgive wholeheartedly, immediately. To the extent as the Rambam says in Chovel Mazik, which is talking about where the person's been hurt. Any person who is quick to forgive, that is praiseworthy, and the Chachamim really appreciate that person. If that's how it is from us to each other, the same, only more so, applies to the Eibishter. Forgiveness is part of the Eibishter's compassion and mercy, and the Eibishter's traits are unlimited. That illustrates that the Eibishter is obviously very quick to forgive us for all the inappropriate things that we've done, in the way of absolute kindness and grace and compassion in a revealed way. And of course, if we know that the Eibush is going to forgive us immediately, and the Eibush does forgive us, that will encourage us to do tshuva in the most incredible way and to do so immediately. And we know that when we do tshuva, as the Rambam tells us, then we'll be immediately redeemed with Mashiach right now.